So we should be live and should be recording. And again, we welcome you to the study of 2 Corinthians. This is the second study in the series. We're going to be beginning in chapter 1 and verse 12. You may notice here on the initial slide that we're going to be making a big jump from chapter 2:13 to chapter 7:5, and that's so that we can complete the historical narrative. So let's come to chapter 1 and verse 12. And remember that the section that we're dealing with has to do with Paul's change of plans. The reasons that he has postponed his visit to Corinth. We went through this very, very quickly in the previous study, but we're going to go through it again, a little more detail, but don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time on it. If you look at verses 12, 13, and 14, you'll see that Paul begins by speaking about his relationship with the Corinthian church. I'm looking at the NIV. He says, "Now this is our boast." That word boast could as easily be translated rejoicing, and it is in many contexts. Sometimes it's translated pride, but in English the word pride is often negative. Here, actually, what Paul's saying is very positive. So this is a cause of glorying in a positive way. This is a cause of boasting or of rejoicing. And that is that his conduct among the Corinthians has not been by human standards. That's verse 12, the end of verse 12. This has not been done with worldly wisdom. That probably is an accusation of the opponents at Corinth, the false teachers, the false apostles. So we have done this according to God's grace. That's a boast, a rejoicing. His conscience testifies that in the relationships of holiness and sincerity, of total openness, total transparency. He says we're only writing what you can understand, what you can read. We're not going to do anything that's hidden, what you cannot see, what you cannot understand. And the point is, and so we translate the word in 1:12 in the same way we do in 1:14. If this is boasting, he says, you will be able to boast about us in the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord Jesus, and we will boast about you. So this is the kind of boasting we're talking about. We're talking about glorying. We're talking about seeing the glory in other people or rejoicing. I somewhat like the translation rejoicing. This is what we're happy about. This is what we look back on with joy. This is what makes us feel good. This is what we can look back on as a very positive kind of thing. So he begins by thinking in those first three verses, 12, 13, 14, about their prior relationship. Then he comes to more details, and we see another principle he sets forth. I'm confident, and we outline briefly what we've already said. He was going to visit them twice. On his way to Macedonia, he planned to stop by and see them. And then on the way back from Macedonia to see them again so they could send him on to Judea. Now, those were his plans, but he's talking about his change of plans. He says, when I made those plans, I did not do it lightly. I did not do it without thinking, without planning. I did not do it thinking, well, I'll be able to deceive them now. I'm going to tell them one thing, but I really intend to do something else. I'm just telling them this to make them feel good. If I can kind of paraphrase and try to get that into a sense that we can understand, when I planned to do this, did I do it in order to be yes and no? And his answer in verse 17, no, I always want to say yes when I mean yes, and I always want to say no when I mean no. I want to be faithful. I want to be dependable. And the reason that he gives for that dependability is that God is faithful. And that's what he will say when we come to verse 18. Now, if we want a context for that part of the statement of Paul, we can go to 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verses 2 through 8 when he gives instructions about the collection. And you notice beginning in verse 5, he says, after I go through Macedonia, I will come to you because I will be going through Macedonia. So we see that he had perhaps had an original plan to go directly to Macedonia based on 1 Corinthians 16, and then he makes a change in plans to see them both going and coming, and now he's changing back to the original plan. You have to see the number of changes to realize why there was an accusation being leveled by the false teachers or false apostles who were saying, you know, Paul doesn't even know what he's doing. He says one thing one time, then he says something else, then he changes his mind and go back to the original plan. So this is the context that we're dealing with. Paul always wanted to proclaim Jesus as God's yes. He did not want a message, verse 18, that was both yes and no. And as the example of that, he uses both himself, Silas, Timothy, saying that there was always consistency in their message, even as there is in God's message through Jesus Christ. That consistency of God that he's pointing to, this is sometimes preached and explained in great detail. As I read it in the NIV, it looks pretty easy to me. It looks as though it's pretty clear what he's saying, and so I'm not going to expand it in great detail. Somewhat says what it means and means what it says. No matter how many promises, verse 20, God has made, they are all brought to fruition in Jesus Christ to the glory of God. And the evidence of God's faithfulness, he outlines in verses 21, 22. And that is that what God has done. That God makes us stand. He makes us stand firm. Both Paul and the Corinthians. God has anointed us. That's the sense of choosing us. He has set his seal of ownership on us. He has put his spirit in our hearts as a deposit. That relates also to the seal of ownership. Here's my phone if you want to look at the PowerPoint in more detail, or you can turn it. Excuse me a minute. My son joined us after some time with family, so I'm hooking him up with the PowerPoint on my phone. So all of that is evidence that God is at work as a guarantee of what is to come. So the last two verses of the first chapter, I call God as my witness that the reason that he continually changed his mind, and especially the reason he is not coming early, he's not coming by Corinth on the way to Macedonia, the reason is to spare them. He did not want to return to Corinth, we will see in chapter 2, with sorrow and with pressure, with difficulty, with severity, with we could say having to correct them. And he does not want to control their faith. He wants them to mature. He wants them to grow up. So he is sparing the Corinthians. And we could say that this is then an introduction to chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. So that's somewhat a review, but a little more detailed concerning what we at least introduced last week. Now, let me stop the sharing and see if we're all together and if everything's going well. We're back without the screen, so I'm looking at all of you, and I see you muted. But if you have a question or a comment, you want to raise your hand, or you want a clarification, or you want to comment on the text that we've looked at, that's fine. This is your opportunity to do that. This is a little awkward. I have to go back from the PowerPoint in order to see all of us. So that's what I've done. We'll resume the PowerPoint in just a moment, and we'll continue to explain Paul's change of plans with another slide, just checking to make sure we're all together in all of that, and there aren't any questions or any comments that we need to handle. Okay, I'm looking at about half of us, and those that I'm looking at, it looks that we're all together. Some of it, I can't tell whether you're confused or whether you're with us. Good to have Catherine joining us here in a couple of moments. Good to have everyone with us. We're going to go back then and continue with another slide to bring up the study of chapter 2. So in a literary section that extends from chapter 1 verse 12 really to chapter 2 verse 13, we have a description of Paul's change in plans. Now, the real reason that he did not want to come early to them, that is on the way to Macedonia, is that he had written to them a letter. He had written to them a letter in an effort to correct them, and we're going to see a reference to that letter in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. He had not only written to them a letter, he had actually made an interim visit from Ephesus, where he was ministering for 3 years. He had actually made an interim visit from Ephesus to Corinth, which was his second personal visit. And we're going to see that that comes in all of that a little bit later on. So he wanted to avoid another painful visit, his second. We're going to have a reference to the third visit later in this letter. But what I want to specifically call attention to is what we know as a severe letter. I explained that in our first lesson in the introduction. So let's look at chapter 2, verse 1. I made up my mind I would not make another painful visit to you. If I come to you and I grieve you, if I make a painful visit to you, how am I ever going to be made glad? I'm expecting that the people who would be making me glad are the very people that I've been making not glad. So how can I expect you to, if we're co-workers together, if we're equals, if you're developing your own faith, how can I expect you to do for me what I'm not doing for you? He's really kind of arguing from a standpoint of equality so that they might have equal relationship each with the other. If I grieve you, then all that's left now is that I'm expecting you to make me glad, even though I have been a source of discomfort and distress to you. So I had written, he says, verse 3, this is the severe letter, I wrote as I did, so that when I came, I would not be distressed. I wrote to you this letter that we call the severe letter, at least that's what I call it. I wrote to you so that when I came, you would have had time to correct the difficulties, so that you would be able to be for me a cause of rejoicing, rejoicing, or again, this is our idea of glory or boasting or pride. I wanted to be able to come and you would make me rejoice, and I have confidence that we're going to share joy together. I'm confident that you will share my joy, but Paul sees that they need a little more time to make the corrections. He says in verse 4, I wrote you out of great distress and anguish of heart, not to grieve you, but in order that you might know my love. And of course, he wrote them so that they would be able to correct the difficulties that he had pointed out to them. So Paul wanted to avoid another painful visit. A part of that desire to have all of the situations at Corinth corrected before he gets there, so that they can just rejoice together. And he's not going to have to correct them. He's not going to have to try to help them change anything. A part of that has to do with forgiveness for a specific sinner that he mentions in verses 5 through 11. The transition is somewhat normal. They need to handle this situation before Paul gets there. He does not want that situation to still be hanging when he arrives. Now, who this sinner is has been the subject of many questions. Many people point back to 1 Corinthians 5, the incestuous offender who had taken his father's wife, perhaps someone who's repented. It could be a leader in the church. It could be one of the opposition. We really don't know. But when this person repents and has been sufficiently punished, the punishment inflicted is sufficient for now, verse 6, it's time to forgive and comfort. Because if we don't forgive and comfort when someone repents, they're easily overwhelmed with excessive sorrow. So Paul wants them to reaffirm their love for him, and of course, Paul's asking them to do the same thing he's wanting to do for them. So he's giving them permission, encouragement, actually in asking them to forgive this person before he gets there. So this is forgiveness for the offender. It hooks pretty closely to chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, and we can see what's happening. Now, I'm hoping that we're okay. I'm not going to take a break yet. In chapter 2, verses 12 through 13, now when I went to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, Paul is now leaving Ephesus. He's telling what has already happened in the past. To appreciate this, we kind of have to put ourselves in Paul's shoes and also to think about all that Paul had done before he wrote the letter, and then he's explaining it to the Corinthians. So here's the context very quickly again of the letter. Paul was ministering in Ephesus. He received information from the house of Chloe that there were difficulties of various kinds, and he wrote a letter. We know it as 1 Corinthians, and he sent it to them. But that did not solve all of the problems. It apparently solved some of the problems, because what we read about and what Paul writes about in 2 Corinthians is not what he was writing about in 1 Corinthians. But then he received additional news of problems. So, as I've just mentioned, he made a visit to Corinth from Ephesus, but did not have success in correcting all the difficulties. Then he wrote them a letter and told them to correct the difficulties. Now he's back in Ephesus, and as we've already read, although the Corinthians have not yet received this information, as we've already read, Paul is not going to go by Corinth, he's going to go to Macedonia. To go to Macedonia, he has to go to Troas, up the east side of the Aegean Sea. He's eventually going to come to Macedonia. What we will learn is that instead of going personally, that Paul sent Titus to Corinth to help them correct these situations. And then Titus was to travel north through Achaia on the western side of the Aegean Sea, and Paul desired to meet Titus to receive news about the Corinthians. When Paul gets to Macedonia, he does meet Titus, he receives the good news, and he writes 2 Corinthians. So that's the historical context. So now Paul is writing 2 Corinthians from Macedonia. He's going to send the book back by Titus to Corinth before he gets there on his third visit. But when we read 2:12, we have to understand Paul's telling them something he's already done before he writes the letter. And it's written in that tense. So now when I went to Troas to preach the gospel, the Lord opened a door, but I had no peace of mind because I did not encounter Titus. I didn't find Titus. I didn't get any news about you. And so I said goodbye to them, and I went from there on to Macedonia, chapter 7, verse 5. And then when we came into Macedonia, we still had no rest because we were harassed on every side, conflicts and fears. God comforted us finally by the coming of Titus. Finally, he encountered Titus. He found Titus, and he not only was comforted by being able to find Titus, but also by the news that Titus brought. Chapter 7, verse 7. Not only by his coming, but also by the comfort that you had given him. Because the Corinthians had accomplished what Paul hoped they would accomplish. He told us about how much you longed for us, your deep sorrow, your concern. And so I was more joyful than ever. We're back to that theme of chapter 1, verse 12 of rejoicing. We're looking at the same theme that we saw in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, about I want us to have mutual rejoicing. And then he says in chapter 7, verse 7, we were joyful. I was more joyful than ever. My joy was greater than ever. I was more boastful, more happy, more rejoicing about the news that I received. And so the reason that today we're looking at the end of chapter 1, the first part of chapter 2, and then skipping to chapter 7, is we're trying to follow the historical narrative. And then we're going to come back and look at, well, what did Paul do between 2:13 and 7:5? What's that all about? Well, that's another study for another class, and it'll become a lot clearer. And I think you'll appreciate the fact that we're able to take kind of a separate section and we're able to give it life and vitality together. But Paul is concluding the defense of his planning. Now, before we come to the detail of chapter 7 and verse 5, I'm going to stop the share again because we've gone through a lot of information looking at the beginning of chapter 2, and you said, well, I hope I didn't lose you when I said something about 7:5. I tried to prepare you for that on the very first slide, that we were going to have a jump. But isn't that amazing how well that reads? I could not find my brother Titus in Troas, and so I said goodbye to them and went on to Macedonia. And then you skip over to 7:5. Now when we came into Macedonia, we had no rest because we still hadn't found Titus. So you see the continuation of the historical narrative. Okay, are we all together? Everyone fine? Any questions, comments at this time? Because we're kind of doing this a little differently than you've probably ever done it before. I doubt you may have, but probably in most cases in your studies of 2 Corinthians, you've not jumped from 2:13 to 7:5. So we've done that. We've done it on purpose. I don't want you to think it was an accident and I had a bunch of the pages of my Bible that stuck together. There are some interesting jokes about preachers with that problem, but I won't share those here. We won't use video space in order to do that. We'll keep the study going. But it was on purpose. We skipped from 2:13 to 7:5. So I think we're okay, looking at your faces and all of that together. Okay, let's come back to the last slide then of what we're going to share together today. Let's come to chapter 7, 7:5. So now we're reading this in context. Paul is concluding the defense of his change of plans that he began in chapter 1 and chapter 2. Now, he's going to continue to talk about this severe letter that we referenced in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. That's the context of chapter 7 and verse 8. When he says, even if I caused you sorrow by my letter, he's talking about the letter of chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. And really, historically, in the historical narrative, it's not all that far back. It only ends up being a long way off because we tend to go through the book chronologically as we have it, and we look at that big parenthetical section before we pick up the reading. So now we see him referring to the same letter that he not too much before referred to when we make the historical skip. Even though I caused you sorrow by my letter, I do not regret it. I did regret it. I did have doubts. I was wondering. I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't have sent that letter. But now I see that my letter did hurt you, but it was only for a little while. It was temporary. Now I'm happy. Not that you were made sorrowful, remorseful is a good way to say that. Not that you were sorrowful, but because your sorrow led you to repentance. And so you became sorrowful as God intended. I'm reading the NIV. This is godly sorrow. And you were not harmed. Actually, they were helped. They did what needed to be done. So that's the context. We often use these verses to talk about the nature of godly repentance. And I love that application, but sometimes we make that application out of the context in which the verses originally were written. So we're talking about the description of the response of the Corinthians to the severe letter, verses 10 and onward. Excuse me. Godly sorrow brings repentance. Worldly sorrow brings death. Godly sorrow produced in you eagerness, earnestness, indignation, alarm, longing, concern, desire for justice. and you showed you were innocent. So I wrote you verse 12, not on the account of the one who did wrong. I wasn't trying to point fingers. I wanted you to respond to God, that you could see for yourselves our devotion for you, our love for you, and so we are encouraged. The last thing that we have in this section, verses 13 through 16, is just a restatement of Paul's encouragement and rejoicing. We're encouraged. Not only are we encouraged, but Titus is encouraged. Not only are we rejoicing, but Titus was happy. He had been refreshed. His spirit was refreshed. I had boasted to him about you, verse 14, and now you have not embarrassed me. You've not caused me sorrow. You've not caused me difficulty. Everything I said to Titus about you was true, and our boasting to Titus has proved to be true, and he loves you. His affection for you is greater. He appreciates you. He loves you. You were obedient. You received him with fear and trembling. I am so glad that the complete confidence I had in you was shown to be true. I continue to have complete confidence in you. So we have the restoration of the relationship that Paul was so concerned about. We have the restoration of the relationship. That's how he began his defense in chapter 1, verses 12 through 14. And now we conclude the defense, and we have the very same thought with which he began his defense. So I hope that you can see, as we look at what's before us on the screen, that as Paul defends his change in travel plans, beginning in chapter 1 and verse 12, and on all the way to 7:16, but thinking about that little skip from 2:13 to 7:5, I hope you can see how, in a way, all of this comes together as a single paragraph. And the theme that begins it is the theme that ends it, so that they come together as a paragraph, and we're able to make some sense out of that part of the book. So here's what we have seen thus far in the book. Salutation and greetings, verses 1 and 2, an introduction, 1, 3 through 11. We spent a lot of time on that last week in our first study, Thanksgiving in Affliction, Comfort in Suffering. Now today we've looked at the last half of chapter 1, the first 13 verses of chapter 2, and the last part of chapter 7, verses 5 through 16, when Paul resumes and concludes his defense of his changed plans. So that's our lesson for today. Before I take down the PowerPoint, I want to tell you where we're going, because here is the summary of the next 4 weeks together. We're going to go back and pick up the parenthetical section, and there are 4 basic themes. Paul's describing his ministry. He's describing the Christian life. He's describing the nature of faith. He's describing the nature of who we are as Christians and what we do. And so here are the 4 topics for the next 4 weeks. Next week, who we are. That will take us through chapter 3. The following week, unless I make a change for the 4th of July weekend, we may delay a bit and we may mark time rather than proceeding, but we probably will go ahead because we're recording, so you would have access to review. But chapter 4 will be what we have, chapter 5, what we know, and chapters 5 and 6, what we do. So those are 4 basic concepts that Paul will be exploring. We'll be exploring them not only with application to ministry, but also to the Christian life, who we are, what we have, what we know, and what we do. So there's the conclusion of today's study, to think about not only the study, but where we're going in the future. So we're ready to bring that all together. We're ready for any final comments or any final questions, anything you'd like me to try to clarify, and we'll soon be done. Any final questions or comments that you would like to bring up here before I stop the video? Anything else to clarify? Okay, wonderful. Then we're going to say goodbye to all of those who have joined us by video, but we'll have a time that we can share together and that we can conclude the class. Thank you for being with us today, to those who were with us by